The morning Harlan Webb drove out to the Murray place, he came in a sensible sedan, the kind a retired bank officer drives when he no longer has to impress anyone. He parked it careful between the grain bins, stepped out into the November mud, and stood for a moment looking at the farmhouse the way a man looks at something he has misjudged for 35 years and is only now willing to say so out loud. The kitchen light was on. It was always on. Cody Murray opened the door before Harlan reached the porch, the way a man does when he has been watching through the window and sees no reason to pretend otherwise. He was 54 years old and wore the same kind of work jacket he had worn at 19. Canvas over a wool liner, the collar gone soft at the fold. He held the door and said, "Come in," and that was the full extent of his greeting. The ledger was already on the table. Let me tell you what that ledger was, and why it was sitting there when Harlan walked in, and why the number Harlan was about to read had been true for 72 years before Harlan's institution had even opened its doors. The Murray farm sat in the east-central part of the county, 320 acres of dark, heavy ground that drained slow in spring and held moisture through a dry August the way good ground does when it has been respected across generations. The timber breaks along the north edge had stood since before any of the surrounding families arrived, and the creek at the south corner had not changed its course in Cody's lifetime or in his father's. The farmhouse itself was built in 1938 and had been added to once in 1961 when Dale Murray enclosed the side porch to make a proper mudroom. That was the last structural change. The kitchen had the same hanging light, the same table, the same 4 chairs, as it had when Cody was old enough to sit at it and understand what his father was writing in that ledger. Dale Murray had started the ledger in 1941, the same year his own father bought the 320 acres from the Hendrick estate for $61 per acre. Total cost $19,720 paid in full at closing. Dale had been 18 then and had watched his father count out the certified check and fold the receipt into the front cover of a composition notebook. And from that day forward, Dale kept every financial record the farm produced in notebooks, just like it. By the time Cody was old enough to read them, there were 11 of those notebooks on the shelf above the mudroom door. The entry that mattered most was dated September of 1952. Dale had written it in his usual plain hand, no commentary, just the fact. The First Consolidated Agricultural Bank of the county had been chartered that month. Dale noted it the way he noted everything. Not because it was important to him, but because it had happened and therefore belonged in the record. He had written, "New bank open on Caldwell Street, charter dated September the 4th, 1952, and then he had gone back to recording his seed costs. Cody found that entry in the spring of 1978. He was 19 years old, and his father had been dead 11 weeks from a heart that went quiet in the machine shed one February morning, with no warning and no ceremony. Dale Murray had been 55 years old, and he left behind a farm without a dollar of debt on it, 320 acres paid for in a year when $19,000 was a serious sum, and 11 notebooks that told the complete story of every payment, every yield, every equipment purchase and payoff, every tax bill and grain receipt, going back to the day his father shook hands with the Hendrick estate executor and took the deed. Cody sat at that kitchen table under that hanging light for a long time, the night he read Dale's ledger straight through from the first entry to the last. He was not the kind of young man who made declarations. He was not the kind who announced conclusions. He sat with it, the way you sit with a thing that confirms something you already felt, without knowing how to say it. The land had been in the family since 1941. He was 19 years old. He owed nothing on it. He drove into town the following week to speak with the bank about operating capital for the spring planting, because that was the practical matter at hand. The First Consolidated Agricultural Bank on Caldwell Street had a new loan officer, a man named Harlan Webb, who had graduated from the State Agricultural Finance Program and worn a necktie every day of his working life since. Harlan was 31 years old and already had the confident posture of a man who has never had a conversation he did not feel he was winning. He looked at Cody across the desk, at the canvas jacket and the work boots still carrying field mud, and he arranged his expression into something paternal. "Son," Harlan said, "you've got a paid-off piece of ground there, and that is genuinely something. Your daddy was a careful man." He paused, letting the compliment settle, the way men like him let compliments settle before the pivot. "Now what you want to do is put that equity to work. We can have you in another 400 acres by fall. Variable rate right now is sitting at 9%, and I can get you a 15-year note at terms that pencil out, even at last year's corn prices." Cody looked at him for a moment. "I'll take the operating note," he said. "Just the operating note." Harlan nodded slowly, the way a doctor nods when a patient declines a recommended procedure. He wrote up the short-term operating note, shook Cody's hand, and said the door was always open. Cody paid the operating note off in October of that same year, on the day he sold his corn, and he did not return to Harlan's office for the next 5 years. He planted the 320 acres in corn and soybeans on a 2-year rotation, kept his equipment older than his neighbors kept theirs, and put the difference in a savings account at a savings institution in the next county over, because his father had banked there, and old habits in that family did not require justification. He drove a 1968 Ford pickup that his father had bought new, and by 1978 it had 140,000 miles on it and started every morning except 2. And on those 2 mornings, Cody walked to the machine shed and found the problem and fixed it before breakfast. Now, if this is the kind of story you come back to, go ahead and subscribe. There is more where this came from, and we add to it regularly. The man who would become his most instructive neighbor arrived in 1983. Pete Alderson was 30 years old and had grown up 2 counties east, and worked for a farm management company for 6 years before he decided he was ready to operate his own ground. He was friendly in the uncomplicated way of a man who has been well-liked his entire life and sees no reason why that should change. He bought 480 acres of river-bottom ground adjacent to Cody's east fence line, took out a variable rate note with First Consolidated at 14.5%, and shook Harlan Webb's hand so firmly that Harlan later told people Pete Alderson was exactly the kind of young operator this county needed more of. Pete came by Cody's place the week after closing, drove up in a new truck that still had the dealer sticker on the door glass, and leaned on the hood to talk. He was genuinely pleased with himself and had reason to be by certain ways of counting. 480 acres, river bottom quality, at a time when land values were still climbing. 14.5, Cody said, when Pete mentioned the rate. Variable, Pete said. But they're projecting rates down by mid-decade. Harlan walked me through the whole picture. Even at current rates, the cash flow pencils if corn holds above $2.40 a bushel. Cody nodded and looked at the fence line between their 2 properties. He said, "I hope it does," and he meant it because Pete was a decent man and Cody was not in the business of hoping for his neighbor's failure. Pete went back to his new ground and Cody went back to his old ground, and the county went on the way counties do, with everyone certain that the way things were pointed was the way things would continue. The following spring, in the first week of April 1984, Cody drove into the co-op to pick up his seed order. The co-op had a long counter along the back wall where the farmers gathered most mornings to conduct the serious business of knowing what everyone else was doing and saying so. There were 7 or 8 men there that morning, and behind the counter was Burl Fitch, who had worked at the co-op for 20 years and considered himself the informal recorder of the county's agricultural standing. Burl was a tall man with a way of raising his voice at the end of a statement that made everything he said sound like a conclusion. Cody had known him since childhood and had never once seen him uncertain about anything. "Cody Murray," Burl said, loud enough that the whole counter heard it. "I heard you turned down a land note again. Second time now." He shook his head with the slow patience of a man explaining something to someone who keeps missing the point. "You are sitting on the best ground in the east end of this county, and you are farming it like it's still 1955. Pete Alderson put together 480 acres in one note. One note? You are going to be the poorest man with the best dirt in the state." The men along the counter had the particular silence of men who are hearing something they mostly agree with, but are watching to see how the recipient takes it. Cody set his order slip on the counter. He waited while Burl totaled it. He paid cash for the seed, picked up the receipt, and said, "I'll see you in the fall, Burl." He walked out. He drove the 17 miles home in the old Ford, the heater running warm by mile 4, Chester asleep across the passenger seat with his chin on the armrest. Chester was a red heeler Cody had brought home as a pup in 1981, the kind of dog that does not need instruction more than once and takes his work seriously. He lifted his head when the truck turned off the county road and settled it again when the farmhouse came into view. He had worked this ground all his short life, and he understood the daily shape of it. What Cody did not do that night or in the weeks after was second-guess the position Burl Fitch had publicly called foolish. He did the math Burl had not done, which was the other half of the ledger. He knew Pete Alderson was paying, at 14.5% on a 20-year note, roughly $3,200 per month in interest alone on that first year's balance. He knew what corn was paying per bushel. He knew the margin on 480 acres of river-bottom ground at $240 per bushel of corn was thin in good years and arithmetic in bad ones. He wrote none of this down because Dale's ledger had already shown him how the numbers assembled themselves if you gave them enough time. He simply kept farming. In 1985 and 1986, he finished the last payments on his inherited equipment. The final check on the old grain drill was $14,200, written in October of 1986 against his grain account, and he wrote it the way his father had written checks, with the full amount spelled out and the memo line filled in. He kept the equipment for another 8 years after that because it ran. With the equipment debt gone, he began to look at the 80 acres that bordered his west side, a parcel that had been farmed by an older man named Vernon Gast, who had decided in the spring of 1986 that he was through with grain farming and wanted to go live near his daughter in the eastern part of the state. Vernon had no sentiment about the price. He wanted $680 per acre, which put the full 80 acres at $54,400. Cody paid it in November of 1986 from savings, adding the receipt to Dale's ledger under the entry for November of that year. The farm was now 400 acres, every inch of it without a note attached. Pete Alderson, meanwhile, had refinanced his note twice in the mid-1980s as rates finally came down from their peak. First to 11% in 1985 and then to 8 3/4 in 1987. Each refinance extended the term. Each extension meant the principal balance moved slowly. Pete was a good farmer, and he managed his cash flow carefully. But he was managing it against a structure that did not forgive a bad year, and the late 1980s handed him two of them. He sold his cattle in 1988 to cover a shortfall, and told Cody about it one morning over the fence, matter-of-factly, the way men in that county discussed losses without decoration. Cody asked how the ground looked for spring. Pete said it looked good, and it did. They left it there. The 1990s moved the way a good decade moves when you are working rather than watching, which is to say they moved fast and left behind a set of results that you only fully read when you sit down at the end of them. Cody planted and harvested and stored and sold and put what was left after expenses into savings, the same savings account, in the same institution his father had used, now carrying balances that would have surprised anyone who drove past the farm and saw the old truck and the 17-year-old combine and the farmhouse with the same two-bulb light over the porch door. He did occasionally run into Harlan Webb at the grain elevator or the implement auction, and on those occasions Harlan was cordial and direct and still addressed him as son, though by 1993 Cody was 34 years old and Harlan was 46, which made the diminutive feel slightly less like advice and slightly more like habit. In 1995, Harlan told him, with the specific sincerity of a man who had reviewed his file, that the window for expansion was better than it had been in a decade, and the bank had products that could put Cody in a competitive position against operators who had built significantly larger operations. Cody thanked him for saying so. He did not follow up. Ruth Murray had her own opinion about all of this, and she voiced it on an October evening in 1997 when the grain prices had softened for the second straight year, and the furnace had developed a noise that was going to require a serviceman. She was not a woman given to complaint. She had grown up on a farm herself and understood the difference between a hard year and a wrong direction. She sat across the table from Cody with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and she said quietly, "I wonder sometimes if we're going to look back and see that we missed something, some window that was open." Cody looked at her for a long time. He said, "I don't think the window was what they said it was." She nodded and drank her coffee. She did not raise it again, not because she was unconvinced, but because she trusted the arithmetic she had watched him do at this same table for 19 years, and because the farm was still theirs and the table was still solid under her hands, and those two facts together counted for something she could not quite name. The following spring, Cody bought the second 80 acres. The parcel came from the estate of a woman named Clara Hofstetter, whose family had farmed it since the 1950s and whose heirs lived in 3 different states and wanted the matter resolved cleanly. The asking price was $88,000 for 80 acres, which worked out to $1,100 per acre, a fair number for that quality of ground in 1998. Cody paid cash from his grain savings account, had the deed recorded at the county office on a Tuesday afternoon, and drove home to tell Ruth before supper. She looked at the receipt. She looked at him. She said, "All right." The farm was now 480 acres, all of it clear. Let me tell you what that number meant in that specific year against that specific neighbor's position. Pete Alderson was farming 480 acres in 1998, and he was on his third refinanced version of the note he had signed in 1983. The principal balance on that note in 1998 still stood at something above $200,000, because 15 years of refinancing and rate reductions had bought him lower monthly payments rather than faster principal reduction, and a bad year in 1993 had required drawing on the line of credit, which had been rolled into the refinance. He was a competent farmer and an honest man, and he was not going to be ruined by any single year. He was simply farming land he did not entirely own, while Cody Murray farmed the same acreage from the other side of a fence line and owed no one anything. Cody and Pete still talked over that fence, maybe twice a month through the planting and harvest seasons. Pete did not know the precise state of Cody's savings accounts. He knew Cody ran the old equipment and drove the old truck and did not expand the way the county's larger operators had expanded. And he drew from those visible facts the same conclusion Burl Fitch had drawn at the co-op counter in 1984, which was that Cody Murray was farming small because Cody Murray did not have access to much more. It was a reasonable conclusion from everything Pete could see. What he could not see was the grain account, or the savings passbooks on the shelf in the mudroom, or the particular quality of attention Cody gave to Dale's ledger on the first Sunday of every month, reading back through the old entries the way some men read scripture, not for instruction they had not already absorbed, but for the reassurance that the method held. Then came 2008. It arrived the way these things arrive in farm country. First as news from somewhere else, then as something the elevator manager mentioned in a careful voice, then as a letter from a bank. The commodity markets broke in the fall of that year, corn falling from prices that had finally been treating farmers well. The credit markets froze in ways that the agricultural lending officers had not planned for, because their stress models were built on the assumption that land values moved in one direction and that operating lines renewed as a matter of course. The operating lines did not renew as a matter of course. Pete Alderson's lender was a regional bank that had been acquired by a holding company in 2004 and then acquired again in 2007. And by the fall of 2008, the people making decisions about Pete's note were in an office building in a city 3 states east, and they had a portfolio review process that did not account for the difference between a good farmer in a bad year and a bad credit. Pete got the notice in February of 2009. The lender was calling the note. He came over to Cody's place on a Wednesday evening, stood in the mudroom rather than coming to the table, and said it plain. They want the balance or the land. I don't have the balance. His voice was level. He had the composure of a man who has had 3 days to make his peace with the thing. Equipment auction is set for March. Land will go to county auction when the title clears. Cody stood in the doorway between the mudroom and the kitchen and said he was sorry to hear it. He asked if there was anything Pete needed in the short run. Pete said no, and thanked him, and drove home in the dark. There are years that settle a long argument, and 2009 was one of them. By the time Pete's equipment auction was finished in March, the county had watched 3 other operations go to similar processes, and the men who had stood along Burl Fitch's counter in 1984 and nodded at the observation that Cody Murray was the poorest man with the best dirt in the county had the experience, if not quite the vocabulary, of revising that assessment. None of them said so out loud. That is not how that kind of accounting works. You revise it quietly, in the private ledger behind your eyes, and you go on. Chester was old by then, 9 years in, and gray around the muzzle, but he still walked the fence lines in the morning and reported back by midday to his spot near the porch steps. He watched the county road with the same level attention he had given it since he was a pup, and when Pete Alderson's equipment truck rolled past in March with the old combine loaded flat on the trailer, Chester tracked it to the curve in the road and then looked away. Pete's 480 acres went to the county auction in June of 2011. Title cleared, and the lender recovered what it could. The sale was held in the old auction barn east of town on a Thursday morning. There were 11 bidders registered. Cody Murray drove the same Ford truck he'd been driving since 1997, which was the year he had finally replaced the 1968 model, and he parked in the gravel lot alongside machines that cost more than his farmhouse was worth, and walked into the barn in his canvas jacket, with Chester riding quietly in the bed. Harlan Webb was in the back row of the barn, retired now, 2 years, but present, in the way retired bankers are present at agricultural auctions, which is to say observationally, without accountability. He saw Cody come in and nodded. Cody nodded back. The auctioneer opened Pete's 480 acres at $320,000. The bidding moved. At $380,000, 3 of the registered bidders had dropped. At $400,000, it was Cody and a farm management company whose representative was on a phone with someone in an office building. At $420,000, the representative on the phone hesitated. Cody raised his paddle once more. $432,000. The gavel came down. Pete Alderson was standing in the back corner of the barn near the side door. He had come because it was his land, and he could not quite make himself stay away from it. And he watched the paddle go up with an expression that had all its feeling held well behind the eyes. Cody did not look at him when the gavel fell. That was a choice, not an oversight. He wrote the cashier's check from his grain savings account the following Monday morning. $432,000, paid in full, deed to be recorded at the county office by Friday of that week. The farm was now 960 acres, and it carried not a dollar of debt. Harlan Webb retired in 2011, the same year as the auction, and spent the next 2 years in the kind of incremental recalibration that men like him conduct privately, reviewing what they had been certain about and what the record now showed. He was not a dishonest man. He had given the advice he had been trained to give, inside a framework that had worked often enough to seem reliable. He understood by 2013 that it had not worked this time. He wanted to say so, not because he owed Cody an apology exactly, but because he was a precise man and the account between them was imprecise, and that bothered him in the specific way that a ledger out of balance bothers a man who has spent his career watching ledgers. He called ahead. Cody said come out Thursday. So Harlan drove out in his sensible sedan and parked between the grain bins and stood for a moment in the November mud. The kitchen light was on. Cody opened the door before he reached the porch. The ledger was on the table. Harlan sat in the chair across from Cody, and Ruth brought 2 cups of coffee and then found a reason to be elsewhere in the house, the particular tact of a woman who understands that some conversations are better witnessed than observed. Chester was at the foot of the porch steps outside, the November wind moving through his rough coat, unbothered. Harlan looked at the ledger. He was 66 years old. He had looked at a great many ledgers in his career, but not this one. Your daddy started this in 41, Cody said. He turned it to the September 1952 entry and set his finger below the line about the bank's charter. He let Harlan read it. Harlan read it. He was quiet for a moment. He set his coffee cup down. 960 acres, Cody said. No note. Harlan nodded slowly. The arithmetic was not complicated. The Murray land had been paid for 11 years before First Consolidated had opened its doors, and the Murray family had never borrowed against it. And the farm that Harlan had looked at in 1978 and seen as undercapitalized and behind had simply kept accumulating while the leveraged operations around it accumulated, carrying costs. The gap between those 2 methods had taken 30 years to become visible. Now it was visible, and it was 960 acres wide, and it had a cashier's check stub in a composition notebook to document the mechanism. "Son," Harlan said, and then he stopped. He was quiet for a moment. He picked up his coffee cup and looked at the table, and then looked at Cody directly. "I was wrong about what you were doing," Cody said. I know you were." Harlan stayed for 40 minutes and drove home in the sensible sedan. And if he carried something different in the set of his shoulders when he walked to his front door, there was no one watching closely enough to say so. Now let me tell you about Burl Fitch, because his accounting was different and came in a different room. Burl was still behind the co-op counter in 2013, though the co-op had changed ownership twice, and the counter itself had been rebuilt in a different place. He was 68 and had the particular vigor of a man who has never changed his mind about anything important and has thus been spared the exhaustion of the process. He knew about the auction, the way everyone in the county knew about the auction, and he had filed it under the category of unexpected things that do not require him to revise the category he had put the person into. In October of 2013, Cody came in for his seed order the same way he had come in every fall for 35 years. He set the order slip on the counter. The men along the counter were different men than the men who had been there in 1984 mostly, but the shape of the gathering was the same. Burl looked at the order. He looked at Cody. And then he said quietly, because he was not a small man, but there are moments that make a man smaller without him choosing it, "I heard you went to 960 at the auction." 960, Cody said. "All of it clear." "All of it," Burl nodded. He totaled the seed order. He did not say anything further for a moment, and then he said, with the specific difficulty of a man who was not built for this particular sentence, "I was wrong about what I said, in here, back then." He gestured briefly at the air in front of the counter, meaning 1984, meaning the 7 or 8 men who had been there, meaning the comment about the poorest man with the best dirt in the state. Cody took the receipt. "All right, Burl," he said. That was what he said. He was not the kind of man who had been waiting 30 years to hear it, and his response was not a performance of forgiveness. It was simply the truth of a man who had not been running the race Burl thought he was running, and had never needed Burl's correction confirmed. He drove home on the county road, Chester in the passenger seat with his chin on the armrest, the November fields brown and finished on either side. The farm ran from the second gravel turnoff to the creek at the south corner, and he could see the grain bins from the road, their silver sides catching the low afternoon light, and behind them the machine shed where Dale's Heart had quit in February of 1978, and Cody had stood in that cold space and become the last Murray man on this ground. The decision about Marcus Alderson came to him not as a formal plan, but as the obvious next thing, the way right decisions usually presented themselves to Cody, which was quietly and without much ceremony. Marcus was Pete's son, 26 years old, and farming rented ground 2 counties west on someone else's schedule. A young man who had inherited his father's aptitude without his father's luck with timing. Cody had watched him since he was a boy walking Pete's fence lines and asking questions that a 10-year-old has no particular reasons to ask unless the land is already doing something to him. In the spring of 2015, Cody offered Marcus 240 acres of the old Alderson ground on a lease at $90 per acre per year against a county average that had moved to $140. First option, to buy when Marcus had the down payment assembled. He laid it out at the kitchen table, 2 cups of coffee, no performance. Marcus was quiet for a moment, in the way that young men are quiet when something's larger than they expected. Then he said, "Why 90? Cody thought about it. He said, because that is what your father would have been able to manage when he started, if the rate had been right. Marcus Alderson signed the lease agreement and started on the 240 acres that spring, and if he worked those fields with a particular attention, as though the ground expected something of him specifically, Cody did not say so, and Ruth did not say so, and the ground itself said nothing. Discipline is not what the loud men preach from the grain elevator steps or in the end-of-year market newsletters. It is what a farmer enacts in the same mudroom over the same accounts at the same kitchen table, year after year, until the table has more meaning than the talk. Cody Murray had 960 acres in the fall of 2015, all of it carrying title back to 1941, and the bank that had advised him to leverage it had been chartered 11 years after his grandfather shook the Hendrick executor's hand and took the deed. He did not mention this often, but occasionally, at the elevator or the implement auction, when the conversation turned to institutional memory, he would say it plainly, in the level voice he had always used, that the land had been in his family longer than the bank had been in business, and let the arithmetic speak for itself. Ruth found him one Sunday afternoon, sitting at the kitchen table with Dale's ledger open to the 1941 entry. The first one, his grandfather's name in his father's handwriting, and the price of the ground and the date of the deed. She brought coffee and sat across from him, and they did not say much, which was how they had conducted the long work of being married for 37 years, in the particular language of people who have stood at the same table through everything that mattered and have come to trust each other's quiet. Chester came in from the porch, gray-muzzled and deliberate, and settled at Cody's feet with the weighted sigh of a dog who has done his work and is satisfied with the day's accounting. The kitchen light was on above the table. Outside, the last of the November light lay flat across the 960 acres, and the ground was still and dark and patient, the way good ground is when it has been respected across generations and is simply waiting for spring.